Here this evening, actually, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Study. Some of you may not know what this institute does. Primarily, it's an outfit that's been here for about 20 years, and our primary responsibility is to encourage and facilitate faculty research and creative activity. But we also like to bring in people who expand all of our knowledge. And we have a program which was started a number of years ago called Distinguished Citizen Fellows. And these are individuals who've made their marks outside of the academy, but who have much to tell those of us within. And they usually come for a week, and during their time here, they visit the faculty and the students, they talk formally and informally, and they also give a public lecture. And the purpose of this public lecture is to give their knowledge to as many people as we can possibly fit into a room on a given evening. So this is exactly the event that we're here for tonight, a Distinguished Citizen Fellows public lecture. And I hope that all of you, or at least many of you, will join us upstairs in room 208, which is called the Rawls Room, for an informal reception afterwards and for a chance to talk to Marc Asnin. And I'm pleased now to turn things over to my colleague, Tiaden Miller, who will introduce our Distinguished Citizen Fellow.
Thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Marc Asnin to our university as a Distinguished Citizen Fellow through the Institute for Advanced Study. But before I introduce Marc, I want to say a word of thanks to Professors Jeff Wolin, Carol Polsgrove, Steve Raymer, and Linda Adele Goodine for supporting his nomination, and to Mary Ellen Mark, Director of the Institute, and Ivona Hedden, Assistant Director, for making his visit possible. For the past 20 years, Marc Asnin has produced extensive and significant bodies of work in a number of photography genres. As an editorial photographer, Marc's portraits and photo essays regularly appear in such magazines as The New Yorker, Time, Newsweek, Stern, The Washington Post magazine, The New York Times magazine, and the French and German editions of Geo. As a corporate photographer, Marc has produced annual reports and advertising campaigns for such companies as Dow Chemical, Nike, and GTE. As a director and creator of still photography for television, Marc has made imagery for Barry Levinson's police drama, The Beat. From the start of his photographic career, however, Marc's real passion has been to make photo essays in the tradition of social documentary photojournalism. This tradition, as old as photography itself, is an attempt to bear witness, to bring attention, and at times to advocate. At its best, this kind of picture making tries to communicate something a concerned and informed photographer felt when he or she released the camera's shutter. The kind of photo essays that Marc Asnin produces are a way of making meaning through a complex distillation of visual truth and interpretation. In this genre over the years, Marc has worked on subjects as varied as Latino migrant labor in the United States and Jewish culture in Cuba. Undoubtedly, his best-known work is the epic photo essay, Uncle Charlie, which explores in both imagery and texts the troubled lives of one branch of the photographer's family. It's a project on which Marc has labored for 2 decades. For his labors on Uncle Charlie, Marc has received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship and a New York Foundation for the Arts grant, as well as several of the most coveted awards in photojournalism: the Mother Jones International Fund for Documentary Photography grant, the Alicia Patterson Fellowship, and the Eugene Smith Grant for Humanistic Photography. Exhibitions of Uncle Charlie have been held at the prestigious annual gathering of contemporary photojournalism, Visa pour l'Image, in Perpignan, France, and group shows at the Museum of Modern Art and the Museum of the City of New York. Selected images from Uncle Charlie are in the permanent collections of the International Center of Photography, the Schomburg Center, and the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American Art. The best photography, whether fine art or photojournalistic, shows what was seen, suggests what was felt, raises questions, and thwarts easy answers. Such images as these stop time, and if we allow it, give us an opportunity to look long and hard at something, to contemplate symptoms and the effects of our actions. Their purpose is to help us come to terms with what it means to be human. This, I think, is an apt description of Marc Asnin's photographs. I'm happy to be able to introduce him here. Before Marc steps in, we'll have a question and answer period at the end of his presentation, if you'd like. But we can also, if we keep that fairly short, we can also meet again upstairs at the reception that Mary Ellen mentioned and continue that dialogue there. And one other point of interest perhaps to the students, on Thursday evening at the School of Journalism in room 157, also known as the Pit, will be an informal meeting with student photographers, faculty photographers, and photo-interested people in general. Just an informal gathering, no agenda specifically planned for that evening, but hopefully an interesting and useful get-together. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Marc Asnin.
Just want to thank you all coming out tonight. I'd like to thank the Institute, all the people Tiagen mentioned to nominate me for this really great gig this week, and especially to Tiagen. So, tonight I'm gonna, I spent the morning in Jeff's class and sort of shared my, history, some of my images, and sort of how I wound up here. What I'm hoping to do tonight is to go through some, as Tiagen said, truly why I became a photographer. Is to document people's lives and, help tell those stories, through magazines predominantly. So I'm going to come and share fairly quickly some stories. I'll talk my way through it. Then I would like to share with you how, my vision has been dealt with commercially. I'll share what I did for Barry Levinson in a video, a short, 5-minute sort of demo reel that I put together. So you have some sense of this is his vision and this is how it was commercially adapted. And then I would like to share with you, the story about my uncle, which would be the main part of the evening. It's informal, any point through the process you want to ask a question, that's totally cool. And I guess we'll start. All right. I gotta lower the lights. I'm not a tech guy, as you can see here, so let's see. Okay, lights. Okay, so the first images you're going to see are a story I worked on many years ago about grave diggers. Interested in working class people and what they do for a living and how they were confronting death. And again, a lot of these early images were times when I was growing as I still am, like any creative person. But that process was about also confronting subjects that were difficult in learning that process. And I spent about a year and a half going to different cemeteries, getting thrown out of some, and hanging out and making these images. A few years later, I had, like, in the late 80s, joined a photo agency, basically after being acknowledged for my Uncle Charlie project. And the powers to be in the magazine world said, well, I mean, he's only photographing his uncle. That's sort of like, that's pretty easy. What can he really do, like, outside? I think that's a pretty narrow vision, because something so familiar doesn't make it easier. But that's sort of what was happening in that world that I was entering. So a timely story was the growth of Nazi skinheads in the Klan across America. With some support from Life magazine, I would travel around over 2.5 years and live with them, hang out with them. And these are some of those images. And I think, like, for the students here or people interested in, making pictures, it's what world you're in now. I mean, if I was gonna go photograph something that at 40 years old, I really wouldn't want to hang out with these, like, young kind of knuckleheads, okay? I think as you evolve and you change and your life brings you to different places, that's where, as a documentary photography, your subjects will appear. I'm interested in photographing, maybe teenage girls now. I have my first daughter going to become a teenager. So, so I would go to different nightclubs, different cities. I would network my way. And some people were networking their way on Wall Street. I was working through the skinhead movement around the country.
Who are you shooting this for?
I had like guaranteed money from Life, and I had a letter, saying, like, this story would, Life had serious interest in publishing it. Later on in the project, that worked against me, because these Nazi skinheads in the Klan perceive Life as an agent of the Zionist occupational government. So I had to change to an Italian letter, because it wasn't okay to be associated with, Life anymore. Again, a lot of my, I would work commercially, I would reinvest my money into projects like this. And it basically was syndicated, sold throughout Europe.
How old were you if you started?
I was in, like, my 20s, like mid-20s, late 20s. My poor parents were always stressing, You know, I would be on the road somewhere calling them. Because in those days, there's something really good when you don't have a lot of money and you're not a successful magazine photographer. You have to live with them, eat with them. You don't stay at the Hyatt. And that's an important thing. That intimacy with your subject is what really makes the difference, and listen, the fact is there was not a lot of money, so you had to just do that. I think I did the story because I was motivated by my concern of what could destroy my life, the life that I was living in New York. The project came to a sudden end after it was published in a French magazine when they, in the first paragraph, said that Marc Asnin, Jewish photographer living in Brooklyn, New York, infiltrated this movement. That was sensationalism, journalism. I didn't do it. Now, we discussed this earlier today. Sure, being Jewish, it could destroy the way of my life for what these people believed in. But I didn't go undercover, but that was just how they sell magazines, and that put an end to me going back out because of my security.
Did they know you were Jewish?
No. They used to think all Jews lived in New Jersey. I lived in Brooklyn, and they didn't meet many Italians, so I used to just tell them I was Italian with my accent. Later on, the Klan was a little smarter, and they would ask me some questions, and I would say, well, I'm a photographer, I don't have any opinions, those are the writers, and they would say, all good white Christian males have opinions. So it got harder as I went, deeper and deeper into a more hardcore group of them. And sometimes, you would slip and say the word like, oh, he's a schmuck. And to them, that was like, the big, that you were a Jew. And I used to say, listen, guys, everyone in New York uses the word schmuck, so. But there definitely were times that, there was some tighter moments.
You said earlier that it's really important to earn their trust and to have that level of intimacy with your subject.
Right.
How did you work on earning that trust and be with these people and interact with them when you disagree with probably a lot of their beliefs and maybe you don't even respect them? Was that a challenge for you to photograph skinheads?
I think the bizarre part was that they're really nice to you personally. Okay, they'll want to give you their pillow to sleep on, or they're really nice to you as a person. But on and you're thinking God, if they only knew who I was. And there were moments. I would call my parents all crying on the side of. I remember on the side of an interstate from a payphone. It was before cell phones. Overwhelmed by being so around such a concentrated group of hate. So yeah, or in Denver once I had a friend I grew up with, and I went to his house and I was just letting it out because I was so overwhelmed, and then he was a knucklehead and he was Jewish and he was talking about how he hated black people. And I was thinking I can't get a break here. It's so yeah, there were those. Ultimately, I'm a professional, or I try to be, and I talked about it earlier. If they were about to I would have probably may have talked them out if they were planning to go do some hate kind of thing. You got to be careful that they don't want, oh yeah, we'll go out and we'll burn some Jewish guy's house. it's good, you know, what we know you want those kind of pictures. You know, obviously, I wasn't going down that road. But the most bizarre thing was they were really always nice to me. I was older than them, so they give you a certain amount of respect. And this is a Klan rally. And then on my other end of and that's the great thing, you know, you go from, you know, Nazi skinheads in the Klan to photographing probably the most famous rabbi after World War II. His name was Rabbi Schneerson. I did this for the New York Times Sunday magazine. You know, stories that you'll work on from being in college, you know, university here, to whatever road you take will, you know, change your life. My children and our rabbi is some young guy I met on this story. You know, he was very good to me after my experience at 9/11. You know, I was at ground zero when it happened. So, you know, who knew 10 years ago that story would help change my life today? And that's been a great pleasure, you know, and this was a story that brought that. It's the first story I ever did in color. And over the years, I kept photographing for different assignments. I'm in the process of working on a documentary video about one segment of this, like this sect of Judaism with a friend of mine. And again, this is what Tiago was talking about. These are like the essays, some examples that I've worked on over the years.
This is much more personal and intimate than the skinhead.
What area of New York is
It's in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. It's where many years ago there was a huge race riot after a young African-American boy was killed by the Rebbe's processional of cars, which wound up with, like, I think a week of riots. Here are just some images. So these are portraits from the New York, some different assignments. You know, so I'll go and spend, this was the first openly gay man to ever work for a president. He worked under the Clinton administration. And I would go spend, you know, 5 days with him at the White House in what job he was doing. So it's just to show how, again, you know, that work translates into like other assignments. Story about high school basketball. I use these for portrait assignments. Story about a young man whose mom committed suicide. Cigar smoking. First, the head of the UN peacekeepers. And a series of portraits I did of German painters for the New York Times. Okay, so that's just like you know, that's an example over the 20 years of projects that I was either, you know, essays that I was assigned to. I think it's like the New York Times, the story about the Rebbe, the reason I was given that assignment wasn't so much because of my photographic skills. Obviously, that was a major part of it. But the editor, Kathy Ryan, knew that I knew a lot about the Lubavitch from just conversations I had with her at different times. So she felt very confident that as a photojournalist, that I would be able to deliver her, that story. Just going to now show you, before I show you Uncle Charlie, I'm going to do it a little in reverse. I'm going to show you like a great, cool project that I was given by Barry Levinson and Tom Fontana, who are famous for TV shows like Homicide: Life on the Street, Oz, which is on HBO, because of my Uncle Charlie work. Okay, abracadabra.
They need to know that it's the black and white still.
Yeah, it's here. Black and white still images of what I did. And the pictures actually appear in the episode.
I don't believe in trouble. I don't believe in pain. I don't believe there's nothing left but running here again. I don't believe in promise. I don't believe in chance. I don't believe you can resist the things that make no sense. I don't believe in silence, but silence seems so slow. I don't believe in energy, but tension is too low. I don't believe in panic. I don't believe in fear. I don't believe in promises that always lead tears.
Okay, so now as, I'm gonna share Uncle Charlie with you, you'll see this was like, these were flashbacks in the cop show about the murder of his mother, about a cop, a very dysfunctional family. And when the people who work with Barry Levinson, Tom Fontana himself, saw the Uncle Charlie project that was presented to them, it fit exactly the vision that they wanted to present of this cop's, dysfunctional family. And it was a great, great project, one of the best things I've ever worked on. So again, that's just sort of how, I wind up in different places. Um, Uncle Charlie basically started, at the place where many of you are today. I was a college student in 1981, trying to figure out what I wanted to do as a photographer, and I think that's important, to share with you, because I don't think people realize that you could start something really special. These are wonderful years that you're having this, a chance to go to university, and it could all start here right now in one of your classes, and it may not start here. The seeds may be planted, but I want you to think, like for me, it started. It wasn't a conscious process. I was just trying to learn how to make pictures, but it did start there, in my freshman year, at a small art college. Uncle Charlie is my uncle. He's my godfather. He was someone I truly adored as a child. He was like my tough uncle. He was tattooed. He was sort of a wise guy. And where I grew up, that was a good thing. To fast forward many years later, when I go to meet Uncle Charlie photographically, he was someone who had suffered bouts with mental illness. He was living in extreme poverty with my 5 cousins and their mother. And I think, I know the project really started more about poverty. I wasn't developed enough as a photographer, as a person, to really understand the complexity that was in front of me. And I think that's part of doing it over 20 years. I grew, and I kept seeing an evolving family. Like all families evolve and grow. They were growing, I was growing as a creative person, and that was part of doing it for 20 years, was to see where he would wind up. You spend 6 months, it's such a small frame of someone's life. And I have to say, like, many people told me I wouldn't do it, that I would give in and let this person publish it or that person. And I think that's the difference between someone who does personal work and is committed to that process, and then, feeling the pressure of like just putting it out. I've done things like this, not, at a big university like this, and the integrity of that process was very important to me. To last the 20 years and to see what would develop. Photographically, me as my uncle, what would happen, and just me as that person and how it affected my life. And I think that was an important part. Again, it's like, it's a traditional documentary photography. The difference here is soon into the project, I started incorporating text. The words are their words about themselves and about each other. I'm not interested, like here, I may tell you, oh yeah, Uncle Charlie's really out there, and because you're not seeing the text, I'll share some of the quotes with you. But in the final end, it's their words to describe their lives. They know their lives better than me. They'll live in it. I still go home at the end of the day, and for me, it's not a process of judging them and saying what's right or what's wrong about how Uncle Charlie lived his life. It's just too complicated, and it's just not for me. My opinion is a visual opinion, and what I've edited and to show the world is that. Uncle Charlie has been married 3 times. All the children came out of a second marriage. Uncle Charlie comes from a very dysfunctional family. You know, he grew up, they had to run numbers, which is gambling. My grandfather was a severe alcoholic, a womanizer. Unfortunately, Uncle Charlie, he couldn't break that process, you know, and he went on sort of passing that on to his children. I was very, to say the least, lucky. You know, I lucked out big time that my mother was able to change her, you know, her circumstances, and that's sort of why I'm so lucky to be here, you know, tonight with you. So when I realized that early in the project that where they were coming, you know, what family they came out of, and again, my mother never shared that, so I wouldn't have known those circumstances unless I had started this project. So I understood my childhood and a lot of things on a much better level or intimate level because of these pictures. My cousin Mary and Jamie. Like here, one of the quotes is, "You were born out of a relationship with a pussy, nothing more or nothing less." We obviously know that's not the kind of dialogue that you really should be having with your son about how he was conceived into the world. So those are the kind of quotes. Sometimes it's poetry Uncle Charlie's written. It's words, you know, that my cousins share about themselves or about Uncle Charlie. This is the mom. She was always waiting, it seemed, waiting for Uncle Charlie, you know, in medical clinics. You know, anyone who's a parent, you know, wanting to be there for your children emotionally because of Uncle Charlie's emotional issues, you know, sometimes in his life diagnosed as chronic schizophrenic, other times diagnosed with other emotional issues like panic attacks. He was never able to be there emotionally for his children. And you hear him explaining that through the 100 hours of interviews I've accumulated over the years. You know, he talks about providing them shelter and food, but he sort of never comes to, you know, love, you know. Again, the process being around them, the more time you're around, the more you're going to see. You can't show up to a project like this at 5 o'clock on Wednesday, you know, once a week. Obviously, in 20 years, I wasn't there all the time, but it was a project, the longest I didn't interact with them was 6 months. So basically in 20 years, you know, and many times I would go there, I wouldn't photograph. It's not always about making pictures, it's about, you know, becoming the fly on the wall. Now, it is my family, but again, that doesn't mean, it's easier than hanging out with skinheads and getting that intimacy. My cousins and my family were very open. My uncle definitely loves being the center of someone's attention for 20 years. It fits into his sort of makeup. You know, looking for like cultural icons like John F. Kennedy, you know, Jesus, you know, Uncle Charlie's Jewish. It sort of tells you it's some conflicting issues in his life. When these pictures appeared in Life magazine, Uncle Charlie was so proud because he told me, you know, him and John F. Kennedy were in the same magazine. And sometimes people think like, well, like that's kind of silly, but not for Uncle Charlie. For Uncle Charlie, it was a big moment in his life because at the assassination of Kennedy, he says like many of his dreams were shattered. And, you know, many years later, he shared the same publication for many, obviously, different reasons. I also think the great thing, and you know, I know we all live in a digital world now, is like the great thing about, you know, making pictures. It's not a scientific process. You make mistakes. You know, here the flash was too high above the camera, and you'll see later on. So as I was learning how to make pictures, my mistakes sometimes gave me some of my best pictures. And for all you young photographers or old who are going to go into this digital world, I think that's something to think about. Like the instant gratification, the instant possibilities of editing, I'm not sure are, you know, better. You know, I once went to a lecture of Henry Wolf, who was a photographer, famous art director, and he said this like kind of joke, yeah, like Kodak says everything gets better every year, the film gets better. He said after 1945 everything went downhill when they stopped making 8x10 Kodachrome. So, you know, Henry Wolf, you could never convince him that a digital Nikon is going to be better than an 8x10 piece of Kodachrome. But I like that, you know, and again, that was just the process of learning. For all the students in the house, when your professors tell you sometimes that you're not doing the right thing, sometimes you just got to believe that they don't know what they're talking about. Sorry, professors, but my teacher told me that this picture, it didn't quite make it because nothing was, you know, the kid in the foreground wasn't perfectly sharp, and, you know, it was one of the better images. It talked about the physical relationship that my cousins had to have with my uncle. It wasn't like what we mostly kiss or hug our parents, or they do the same to you. They had to rub his feet. On some level, they hated it, but on a deeper level, it was great. Like it was the only physical contact they were allowed with their father. After looking, now what you'll see tonight is you know, a certain selection of Uncle Charlie. I would tell you 90% of the project is always inside. Now, was it hard sometimes in this neighborhood to make pictures on the street early on? Yeah, it was somewhat intimidating, somewhat dangerous. But the reality is that Uncle Charlie was basically housebound for many years, and also my cousins were not given the freedom to hang out. They sort of had to wait and be there for my uncle. You know, when Uncle Charlie always had guns. Like when I was a kid, he showed up to my house once and showed me he had like a .38 in his glove compartment of his car. And I thought, God, that's cool, you know? Like my father doesn't have any guns. And years later, you know, Uncle Charlie always had guns. Used to think it was for suicidal reasons. It was also somewhat for protection. He lived in a very tough neighborhood. You know, looking for moments early in the morning when my aunt would get her diabetic. You know, she would get her insulin. She was a diabetic. And I think it's also important, like my pictures are not, you know, and you can share with me later if you don't agree, but I don't try to make them like, you may not know what's going on here, and that's sort of okay for me. I don't need the literal picture, you know, to share with you. Like later on you'll see like a picture and it talks about like my uncle's addiction to Valium and how that's changed his life. I don't have like him on the line at the pharmacy. Like I'm not interested in that literal image. It's just a picture of him, you know, with a pill of Valium in his hand. So I've tried to sort of stay away from that. You know, like I had an agent who told me when 1990 came, I needed something to sort of show that it was the 90s. You know, and I believe like the pictures, you know, they would happen for themselves. They always had big dogs. Whoops.
There's a lot of text interacting with each
Right. We'll get to some that have, you know, I mean, again, as the process changed over 20 years, if I, many years ago, would have, let's say, a show at the University of Iowa, all 50 images had some kind of text. In the final, like, book or exhibition, some may have text, some may have documents. I have letters from his rabbi, from his school teacher saying he would do great things. I have drawings when he was in like, you know, mental institutions or, you know, outreach mental programs that he would draw. I have letters, Happy Father's Day, very guilt-ridden to my uncle. I have love letters. So all those things are incorporated to help tell the story. So far, I've scanned digitally about 180 documents that will be obviously edited down. Access, Uncle Charlie's always sick, so he's going to the hospital. One summer, my cousin was threatening to beat a few kids up on the block. They decided that he needed to go to the psychiatric ward. My cousins, many years later, were not very happy about this project. So again, it's something to think about when you enter in, if you photograph your friends, community, you know, your wife, your husband, your lovers, whoever, there are sometimes ramifications of that interaction. Here the quote is something like, you know, Mrs. Henschke, you need to raise your son Charles. You know, you can no longer ask Charles to raise your children. And the guy, you know, was like sort of my first interaction with the psychiatrist. He hit it on the head. They were making my oldest cousin raise his siblings, and he was a young teenager and couldn't take that responsibility or that pressure. This is my cousin through, you know, the window. Sometimes that's better. I didn't have that ability then. I just sort of figured it out on the go. Uncle Charlie, horny, at a party they were having. seeing things like when I was a kid, during the late 60s, everyone rode on their sneakers. I mean, I was too young to really be a hippie, but that was like what we did. And here, in a different, community, economic, culturally, it was all about keeping your Nikes as clean as possible. So looking for those things within what a group that you're photographing. In this series, there are pictures like this picture I wouldn't use this picture any longer, let's say in a final edit. And I think when you're creating something, especially over a period of time, you need to get beyond that everything you create is precious. And that's for the young people here or wherever you are, the editing process is as important as the creating process. Because it's then how, the person viewing your work, if they're overwhelmed and it becomes a Bible of pictures, they are not going to be as affected as if it's a powerful edit. Looking for the relationships between, the neighbors, Charlie and his kids. This is what, for many years Charlie walked with a cane. Most of the pictures were very obvious, or I didn't execute them well. This is one where I think it worked well. I use a poem that Uncle Charlie wrote about his wife, how like she was the greatest wife. A few years later, she left him for another guy. So using, again, their words constantly with the pictures. At one point, they all went to foster care. My oldest cousin lucked out. He didn't think so, but he went to my parents' house. He truly hated my mother. And this is a picture I did of them. Visiting day at a boys' home. Kid on the left hadn't seen a parent in a really long time. My cousin's like, back up, it's my mother, my time. And again, I would go and do those activities with like my aunt. My uncle was never able to go to those things. I also went as their cousin. I also think it's interesting if you create work like this, it's the pictures you decide to take or not to take. The night my aunt left, my cousins were sitting on their kitchen table crying. I chose not to photograph that moment. I chose to be their cousin. I mean, much older than them. And I think that's something for you to think about. Did I make the wrong choice as a photographer, or did I make the right choice as a person? And also, is it different if you're photographing your family or if I was photographing somebody else's family? Visiting day, my 3 cousins here were in a foster home in Long Island. Cousin hanging out with kids, in his basement. The woman on the right seat wound up becoming the mother of his children many years later. My cousin, obviously in a very different setting. It was like in my mother's living room, this tacky pictures on the wall. Pretty different, you know, environment than, you know, Uncle Charlie. They're trying to show the cultural makeup or generational changes in the community. Again, you know, the great mistake of traditional photography, the flash didn't go off. Or I shot one picture, and by the time I went to shoot the next picture so quickly, the flash had not recycled. Again, I think you should think if you're shooting digitally and immediately look at that frame and think, oh, that's a mistake. That could be a great image, you know. I don't know if, again, like if the instant editing is I think it's something to think about. This is the first birthday without their mother, and it quotes something like, "My father never wished me a happy birthday." Like she's focusing on her father, even though truly one of the big or a huge issue is her mom had left. I think also the idea of spending, my uncle no longer lives in this apartment, but constantly going back and looking at the same thing in the same place was very interesting to me. Over so many, years, I kept, 15 years or 17 years, I kept finding new things in those same 4 rooms, which I found very interesting. Why didn't I see it 5 years ago? Not just because I'm slow. So I like that, constantly going back to the same location and looking and looking. The quote here is, "My mother told me she didn't want me, she didn't love me, and if she would have had the money, she would have aborted me. There are some days I dream of not being born." Now, there's nothing I could say that would have that, heaviness, that emotional insight. That's the kid's life, And again, I think it's also important for me, I grew up in a, let's say, working class, middle class family. We struggled for money, but it was a safe neighborhood, and my parents, I was the center of their universe, and my grandmother couldn't be happier who I was and helped make me who I am. For me then to go there and sort of judge them, it's like a limousine liberal. And for me, that's not where I can be as a person, It's not. So I think it's, when I see photographers go and, and they go up and, they did this, I know this photographer does this project up in the Bronx, and, it's all about him and how he went, and it was tough in the street, and it's like, who really cares? That's your gig. You chose to do it. They didn't choose to be in that situation. And I think it's not, like here tonight, I'm sharing my stories with you because that's what I was brought here to do, but I think it's a very careful balance if you're not lecturing or, being part of an educational process. No one, when I put the book out, should really care how I got there. It's just not the me part of that, it's what I recorded. Also, I think it's important who talks about your work. I had an agent who said, when she would show Uncle Charlie, and it's the same thing, you're in class, it's important how you learn to talk about your own work. She would tell people, oh, it was the decisive moment, that's what Marc's great at. He just made one moment, he captured that moment. That's not how I make pictures. Some of these pictures are just one frame. I was just sitting on the floor watching my cousins moving around. There's a roll of film and I'm just watching them, and she just rolled over, and that's, to me, like in a moon shape, her face, and that was it. Like, that was the moment. So it's important, if you wind up being exhibited, represented, by a gallery, by an organization, that the process of how you create is respected. I mean, I couldn't tell my agent anything. She knew more about Uncle Charlie than I did. So, now the quotes they're not recorded at the same moment as the picture. They were done at different times, and then they're worked in with different images. First Christmas without their mom, the school newspaper ran this picture with the wonderful story they wrote. All of a sudden, Uncle Charlie, as my aunt left, he sort of became not housebound. He got out of bed, and a whole new phase in his life was he was falling in love. Or he was, he all of a sudden, he was experiencing a whole sexual side of him that I never knew. Like, Uncle Charlie just basically laid in bed. I perceived him, he had 5 children, and we obviously know how that happened, but I didn't see any sexuality to him. And right about the time that my aunt had left, crack epidemic really was exploding in his neighborhood, or all over America, and he started hanging out and letting different women addicted to crack live with him. And this woman, her nickname was Blanca. And it's interesting that I said, like, he was falling in love. One of my cousins in an interview, maybe like a year or 2 ago, told me that the woman he loved the most was Blanca. Now, Charlie had told me that plenty of times, and I thought, wow, like, it's pretty heavy that he knew he loved the woman the most that wasn't her mom. And for my cousins, it really changed permanently, and you can hear it through their words and see it through the pictures, where they become much less involved in Uncle Charlie's life, because the stigma of Uncle Charlie living and having these sexual relationships with crackheads really forever changed their interaction. The words of Charlie, why should he be held guilty for being with Blanca when their mother was living with an alcoholic, and a severe alcoholic? That was her 3rd husband. So again, if I wasn't here tonight and you were seeing this, and I think it's a very different experience if you don't know all those things. And in the final product, you will know that through the documents and the words. Charlie straightening up. For many, in the early years, I would come and Uncle Charlie would tell me, you're going to visit me by the window, just like you used to visit Grandpa. I'm going to die by the window. And my grandfather, from 1959 to 1969, he had had a stroke in 59, and he sat by a window for 10 years and drank himself until his liver was shot. That was I was the only one who knew my grandfather as a grandchild, and that was a very heavy image, for me to deal with at 18 years old, and many years later I made this picture that I sort of fit, this was like a view out of Charlie's window. My cousin had some children with that woman I talked about earlier. So I was interested in seeing, you know, that development, how they would have children, and what would they be like. Again, it's interesting how, you know, the people you photograph and how they perceive themselves. Like this picture or another picture was once seen by one of my cousins, and my cousin was clearly like, you know, she knew Uncle Charlie sort of looked dead. She would say he looked terrible, like a death mask. And Uncle Charlie's response was, no, I look great, you know? So again, it's how people, when they're, you know, in any whatever venue it is, what they take from their photographs, people you photograph, or people just viewing your photographs. Again, my middle cousin trying to assimilate, you know, be like Uncle Charlie, identifying with that sort of tough guy persona that Charlie still to this day thinks he is. My wife always says that Uncle Charlie's a nerd. He would never perceive himself like that. I used to call her Aunt Blanca. She was around for, you know, I would say a good year or two, a good 2 years before I even tried to photograph her getting high on crack. On some level I felt bad, you know, to photograph her doing that. There were, you know, a bunch of reasons, you know, that I just sort of didn't deal with it. If I was on an assignment doing this kind of story, the first moment that opportunity would be there, I would take that opportunity because it's a very different process, responsibility, timing to come back with those images. And I don't know if I don't think that pressure is always good. Photographed Blanca many different, after this, you know, getting high in different places in the building or in Uncle Charlie's house. My cousin, before the Gulf War, wound up going to the Army. Lied to the U.S. Army, told them I was doing a story about youth in America. I had a magazine that helped me perpetuate that lie against the government. Went to boot camp, hung out. They all told me that this kid must be a famous kid if I was there to photograph him. They thought his father may own the magazine. He should have only known. Also went back for graduation. In the text is important because my cousin, he didn't join the Army to defend America. He joined the Army to get to go to college. And his luck, the Gulf War was about to happen. And there's a lot of, you know, quotes about my uncle tormenting him, telling him he would go to the front. He would call me. I was at the University of Michigan just as they started bombing Baghdad, and my cousin telling me he was going AWOL, and I was pleading with him not to, that I would get him a good lawyer. I knew all those lefties at the Village Voice, and they would help me hook him up, that you couldn't go to the front until they called your unit up, that Charlie was telling him he was going to the front. You don't go one soldier at a time. So again, Uncle Charlie wasn't really being understanding about his kid facing possible death and something he truly didn't even understand. the night out after graduation at boot camp. My cousin, Uncle Charlie, and the kid, granddaughter. When their mother left, I stayed in touch with her. My uncle never knew that for many years. I did that journalistically because I knew eventually she would probably reappear. I was interested in what her life was like. This is the first birthday that Carol and my cousin Joseph shared, and with his, like, quote-unquote stepfather. Charlie at home with his last daughter, Jamie, still living there. You know, and the slides are, the images, if you see prints this week in some of your classes, are much more tonally consistent. These slides are done at different times, so that's why some of them are much more contrasting. That the unveiling of my grandmother's tombstone, which is a tradition in the Jewish religion, a year after the burial. Again, and Uncle Charlie, you know, it's my father consoling my cousin. Blanca and Charlie, Blanca getting high. Again, how your pictures are used and where and when. I had pictures published in, I won the Eugene Smith grant, and then they published like one picture in Popular Photography with a little press announcement, and my uncle called me and said, Blanca's sister saw me and Blanca in Popular Photography. And I was like, what is Blanca's sister doing seeing Popular? I haven't seen it yet. He goes, oh no, she gets a subscription. Well, when Blanca found out that I got $12,500, Blanca never wanted to talk to me again. Because for someone addicted to crack, that's like a lifetime supply. So how your pictures are used, where and when, can totally change your interaction, you know. There was no, I had spoken to her later. She found Jesus Christ in a drug rehab program. I found her, but even that relationship with Jesus didn't cut me a break. I was still on the outs. My cousin, he was drinking a lot, they said, and so my middle cousin, this is my youngest male cousin, my middle cousin busted him a black eye, figuring that would teach him, don't drink anymore. Charlie and Blanca. I once did a fellowship. I traveled through Virginia teaching from junior high school students to senior citizens, like how to photograph your family in a different way. You know, not like cheese looking at the camera. And for some reason, there was a teacher in the junior high school, and she said something like, oh, is that Charlie kissing his daughter? And one of the kids said, you don't kiss your daughter like that. You know, the kid perceived that that's not how a father kisses his daughter, that it was too sexual, which I thought was, you know, interesting insight. Also, how your pictures affect people in that junior high school, which was in Fort Lee, Virginia. In the afternoon, they saw Uncle Charlie pictures in the morning and other photographs of people who photographed their families. In the afternoon, they took press type and took family pictures and put them together on some like mat board or, you know, construction paper. And this young girl stood up and she showed a picture, and it said, it was a headshot of a mother and father. Father married the woman he loves the most in the world. And then it said, not my mother. And she showed that to her classmates, and the teacher told me the kid had seen all year like a CSW at school, because she couldn't really confront that her father didn't marry her mother. And she said, you know, you came here and you told them all about your family and your sort of family secrets, and she sort of felt liberated. And that's one of the best things that ever happened in me sharing my pictures, that this young kid realized that it's okay. She wasn't from maybe an open community, you know, that it's okay, you know, we all are who we are. And that was a very rewarding experience. Pictures of my cousin and his kid. They both had the same fat lips. Tiago was trying to give me apples before I came here, and I would have had a fat lip like that, you see? Uncle Charlie hustling, shooting pool. He's out in the community. You know, this is a bodega that was easy to get access to because the guy who owned it used to call me cuz. He knew me since I was a little boy coming to visit Uncle Charlie. Bachelor party my cousin threw for his friend, who's the guy topless. You know, making sure that you get access to those moments. My cousin getting ready for a high school prom, went on the prom, had some decent access, was going to leave at a certain point so my cousin could just have her night. But I left early because there was some kid there who I had photographed in this gun story. And when he gave me the big hello, big kiss and hugs, the school was totally weirded out that I knew this sort of gangbanger kid. And they were like, I think it's time, like they knew something was wrong. They didn't know that was my cousin. You know, again, I told a lie. And, you know, I mean, you can't really tell people I want to show up and photograph your prom because my cousin's there. Like, they don't think that's that's important. You know, they don't understand that kind of project. So if you say, well, I'm doing a story about proms for whatever publication agreed to help me, you know, that gets you the access. It'd be interesting to think if the people here tonight think that's not, you know, I mean, it's lying, we know, but if that manipulation is good or bad. Getting done up. Kid on the left can't believe that's Mary. You know, he's like, oh boy. Right after this, I was basically asked to leave.